That is one of my favorite Lenten songs. It disturbs some people there because it does not resolve or end the way that most people expect a song to, but I think that is especially appropriate here in this season of Lent as we are considering the state of our heart and our great, great need that we have of Jesus Christ. We consider that love, but what happens next depends upon will we receive that love. And so there's an open-ended question there, which is a really good lead-in for the story that we have today. But first, let me ask you a question. How many of you reluctantly or not reluctantly spend any amount of time watching the news, gleaning the news, following headlines, checking out stories somewhere, anywhere throughout the week? If you do, you know that our news today is full of stories of all kinds, where somewhere, someone, or maybe many people find their world crashing down around them, the result of events that are out of their control. Well, our text today tells a story. Jesus tells a story in our text today that really probably begins a little bit as a nightmare for many. A man's world comes crashing down around him, and here's the thing. It's not by events outside of his control. It is by his own hand. But the story doesn't end there. There is a twist. We actually have two different endings, and we are confronted with a choice that determines what will become of us. So with that said, I invite you to take out your Bibles or pick up the Pew Bible. You can follow on the screen, of course, but take out your Bible, if you will, and turn to Luke chapter 15. We're going to hear a very familiar parable. Now, the reading is actually two pieces. Luke chapter 15, beginning at verse 1 through 3, which really kind of gives us the setting, and then we'll skip down to verse 11 and read through 32 to have the actual story or parable that Jesus teaches. So beginning at the beginning of chapter 15, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set out for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, 'What was going on?' 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, come home, you kill the fatted calf for him?' My son, the father said, 'You are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I'm sure that many of you have heard this story told before, but as we begin, we have a little bit of an issue here with it to start out. How do we frame this parable? Some Bibles name this parable the parable of the lost son. Others might say it is the parable of the prodigal son. That's probably the most familiar title that many have in mind when they hear this story. Lost son or prodigal son. But to do either is to name the parable in terms of the younger son only and at a particular point in the story. However, really, this is a story of two sons. This is a story of two brothers. One who came to understand that he wasn't worthy of his father, but found love and acceptance anyway, and the other who believed that he was worthy in every way, but clinging to that may have thrown away what he already had. As such, we can break this story then down into a couple sections. Let's call it Act 1 and Act 2. Act 1 is the younger brother, and Act 2 is the older brother. So with that in mind, let's work our way through this parable of the two sons, the parable of the two brothers. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. I would imagine many of you have heard before, you understand, thoroughly understand, for the younger son to ask such a thing, it is tantamount to saying to his father, "I wish you were dead." This is a gross statement of disrespect for the younger son to ask his father for his share. Normally, the share that goes to any son, any relative, comes to them upon the death of the father or the one that they're waiting on. But in a display of graciousness, the father honors the request. The father gives this son his share. Now, in the practice of the people in this time, that would have amounted to about 1/3 of everything that the father had. The practice there from the laws is that the older son would get, or the oldest son would get a double share. Since there are only two sons, divide everything in three. The older son's going to eventually get 2/3 of everything dad has. The younger son is going to get 1/3 of all that the father has. That is quite a deal if you think about it. And I want you to think right now where you are. Right now where you are at your point in life. If someone who had some kind of claim on you, or you acknowledged them, came to you and said, "Seth, I want my share right now." And Seth's got to think, "Oh my Lord, okay. The house, the car, the weed eater, the bank account, whatever it is. Take everything you have." It's dangerous to make eye contact. Sorry, Seth. Take everything you have. Take everything you have and divide it in three and give away 1/3 of that to this person. Give it, just literally take 1/3 of your possessions and give it to an ungrateful, disrespectful person. That's what this father is doing. And it's not some ungrateful, disrespectful tax agent. It's an ungrateful, disrespectful child. Just ripping away 1/3 of everything you've got. That is quite a thing to imagine. But the father does it. He gives to his younger son his share. We think about that from the Father's perspective. If we understand the Father in this parable in some way as our Heavenly Father, well, here is an implicit symbol showing how God is gracious and generous beyond measure and allows us choices. You can probably imagine there are many scenarios today where someone would come and say, give me this, and dad or grandma or grandpa or somebody say, nope, you're not ready yet, or nope, you're crazy. God is generous and gracious. He has good things planned for us. The best way to go about that and to receive them would be to receive them in the way that He intends to give them to you. But God is gracious and generous and will allow us to live by choices that we make. He will not force us. He desires our hearts and our willing service, but He will not force us in that. So the younger son asks for this incredibly brazen request, and it is granted. Verse 13 continues, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country. Now, taking all that he had and literally going away, the younger son demonstrates he has no intention of coming back ever. Having rejected the father, essentially saying, I wish you were dead, Pop, and taking all that was his, there's really nothing to come back to. That's what's going on here as he takes all and he goes away to a distant country. But not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. Who didn't see that coming, right? He squandered his wealth in wild living. We see further here the desire of the younger son, the immaturity of this younger son. We see him in his failing, in his weakness. He had no desire to be accountable to his father or anyone else. He wanted to be his own master. He wanted to do as he desired. Take everything he had, do what he would, how he wanted, when he wanted, wherever. He wanted to be his own boss. And he does. He does it so completely, he ends up with nothing. It's not only an egregious, ugly, horrible scene to consider how it started out, but now it is absolutely tragic with the results of this. And you take that one step further. If we consider the totality of what this younger son has done, there are scholars who argue very convincingly that the young son has broken the law. You find it in Deuteronomy 21:18-21. He's broken the law that we find there in such a way that this young man, this son, who's rejected his father, is deserving of death, or at the very, very least, excommunication, that there would be no possibility of him ever coming back, that his family now would reject him. This is a serious, serious thing that he has done. Keep that in the back of your head for what will come later in the story. Well, after he had spent everything, verse 14 continues, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So here now we have this young man, and he is in a jam. He has spent everything he had. On top of that, famine in the land means that resources are strained for everyone. Where can you turn for help when everybody needs help? There is no help to be found, even from those who previously he might have counted on his friends, from those who had taken advantage or been blessed by his way of living, shall we say. He had nowhere to turn. He is absolutely desperate, that it says in verse 15, he went and hired himself out to the citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. Now, I want you to consider for a moment, here you have a young man who got in a jam, and what's he doing? He's trying to help himself out. you look at that in a certain way, and that might seem to be a little bit noble. He's not sitting back and saying, woe is me. He's not just going and hiding under a tree and waiting to die. He's not out robbing or doing something like that. He's trying to do something about this. But Leviticus 11:7, Deuteronomy 14:8, God's law makes it very, very plain. Pigs are unclean. Pigs are unclean to the Jews. And so what he ends up doing is a great indignity. It is an absolute humiliation, and it is degrading. It is the lowest form of work that you could possibly imagine. And obviously, it's not even enough, because in verse 16 it says, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. It is hard to imagine sinking any lower when you don't even see yourself as well off as something that is detestable to you. He was not only feeding the pigs, he was jealous of the pigs. They had more than he did. Think about that. It would seem that he is at rock bottom, and the text would indicate that he knows it. He begins to consider what he has lost. Verse 17 continues, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Now, there's an argument to be made here, if you're a little on the cynical side, that this is maybe a little bit calculating and desperate. Listen, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am serving to death? I mean, after all, this is the guy who went to his father and said, give me what's mine. He took it and he spent it. I mean, this guy is so self-centered. Is this just now the latest ploy for him to get what he needs? You know, basically say anything to get what he needs? You can see it that way, but I think that we should see humility and repentance, because he's formulating how he will confess to his father. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. We throw that word sin around an awful lot. Here, that word sinned in Greek is hemerton. It is a verb, first person, singular. Now, I was never really good at those parts of speech in English, and I never really cared for them, but trust me, that is very important right here, right now, in this particular instance. Hemerton, sinned, is a verb, it's first person, it's singular. What that means is that the son is taking full responsibility for his actions. He's not blaming somebody else. He's not deflecting. He's not trying to distract. He is taking full accountability, full responsibility for his sins. He's stating, I've done wrong. I've offended you. And the result is that he sees himself now no longer worthy. Worthy, axios, the word means fit or deserving. He's no longer fit or deserving to be called son. It's not appropriate for him to even be considered to be called son due to his actions. The son does not use that word lightly when he's coming before his father and saying, I'm not worthy. He's acknowledging his father as master, as in control, and yet he doesn't want to be treated as a son. I'm not worthy to be treated as a son. Treat me as a slave, as a servant. He doesn't use that word lightly, and neither should we. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 37 to 38, elsewhere Jesus teaches and says this, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. The question of worth when we look at our worth and we look at God, is a very, very important one to understand on the deepest possible level. This young man, this young son here understood his actions made him no longer worthy even to be called son. So he makes up his mind. He makes up his mind what he will do. And in verse 20, he goes. He got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him and ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him. Before the son could even say a word, he had this whole speech in his head. It was a good one. Before he could even say a word, he is already being welcomed by the father. The father obviously has been watching for him. He saw him a long way off. Despite the insult, despite the affront against the honor of the father had been looking for his son. You can only imagine he's been praying for this day, hoping against hope for this day that the son who had gone away would return. And when he sees him coming back, he is overjoyed. The father is so overjoyed to see this son coming back that now the father suffers the indignity himself. He had an affront to his dignity with the son asking the question in the first place, but now he suffers an indignity against his own self, against his own honor, by running out to greet his son. And this welcome then hints at the radical acceptance that the father will soon show. This is just precursor. This is just as the opening little bit of how welcoming and how embracing the father will be of his son. This is what he does before the son even says a word. Now, some people with that kind of reception, like, well, I don't need that little speech that I had prepared anymore. This is going to turn out just okay. All right? But no. If you doubt the motives of the son planning to return, we see that his intent to confess comes from the heart, because he's already been welcomed home in a way that was more than he could have imagined, more than he could have hoped for, but still he follows through with his plan to confess to the father. In verse 21, it continues, the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And I have to believe, as I'm imagining this story unfold, close your eyes and imagine that scene, the father running to greet his son. I'm imagining when the son is saying these words, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. He's still in the embrace of his father, pouring out his heart to him. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. The son returning was only hoping for the barest of acceptance, the barest of acknowledgement. And the father showers mercy and love and acceptance. That ring, the best robe, it would have been the father's ring and robe itself. This is a picture of restoration. This is a picture of new life, of hope and a new beginning. And it is celebrated. Boy, if we could only stop right here. If we could only stop right here. What an overwhelming, heartwarming story this would be. But this is only Act 1. Intermission. Okay, don't run for a popcorn. Act 2. Act 2, the older brother. Picking up at verse 25, meanwhile the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come home, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. All right, honestly, show of hands. Can you blame this guy? I mean, really? Can you blame this guy for being a little bit ticked, being a little bit upset? Can you blame him? He did everything right. He did everything that was expected. He did everything he was supposed to. He was faithful. He was obedient. And now all this fuss over one who's brought shame and disgrace to the family? The older brother became angry and refused to go in. Verse 28, yeah, I'm sure he became angry. If this was the cartoon version here, you'd have the picture of the older brother and you'd see little storm clouds over his head and he'd be fuming. It'd be a very, very, very dark picture. He is angry. You know, with the luxury of time and distance, we can look on this older brother and we can be reminded of the parable that Jesus told of the workers in the vineyard who were hired at different times of the day. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. You remember in that parable there, owner of vineyard went out and hired workers. He hired some at 6 in the morning, and then 9 o'clock, and then noon, and 3, and 5 o'clock. And when the end of the day came at 6 o'clock, he lined up all the workers to pay them, and the ones that were hired last got a full day's wage. People that were hired first in the morning are thinking, jackpot, we're going to make some bank today. Only when it got their turn, they got exactly what everyone else before them had gotten. They got a regular, normal day's wage. These who had borne the heat of the day were upset and jealous and bitter that those who came later, who did less, got the same wage, which really was what they needed to survive. If they didn't get a whole day's wage, there would have been empty bellies and lack at home. These first ones who had what they needed, who did what they agreed to do, were jealous and they were upset at the graciousness of the owner. Well, here the older son is quite obviously angry and bitter at the display of forgiveness by the father. Now, what we might easily miss because we're focused on the older brother and we're seeing him all twisted up inside, his father went out and pleaded with him. The father, as he had done with his younger son, reaches out to the older son. Whether the older son sees it or not, the father loves him. He loves both of his sons. He does not love the younger son at the expense of the older son. He loves them both. Sadly, the older son does not see that the father loves him too. He's too caught up in bitterness. His response to the father, he answered the father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed a fatted calf for him?" This older brother's bitterness is so complete, so pervasive. The older son, the older brother, doesn't even recognize the younger son as brother, this son of yours. He is convinced of his rightness. He is convinced of his righteousness. The father, undeterred, "My son, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Here at the end of the parable, along with the two parables before it, we began Luke 15, 1-3, the little intro, the little setting setter. And then what we didn't read was the parable of the lost coin and the parable of the lost sheep. This parable, along with the lost coin and the lost sheep, shows us so well the unfathomable love and mercy of God to save all, to restore all to relationship to Him. You know, in the end, neither son was worthy. The younger son realized it, but in the end, neither son was worthy. Both sons had what they had. I want mine. Both sons had what they had from the father because of the father. Really, it all belonged to him. But the father would bless both sons. God would bless all. But even when both in their own way turned away from him, whether both are blessed or not is ultimately going to come down to, will each accept from the Father what the Father has for them on the Father's terms. Powerful, powerful parable. If we're really to understand this parable, though, we need to take into consideration one more thing. This is more than a parable about two brothers. This is more than a story about two brothers. This is a story about two groups of people. The younger son represents those who have turned from God, sinners, tax collectors. The older brother represents those who feel that they are in complete obedience to God. They are righteous because of all that they do, namely Pharisees and teachers of the law. Why do I say this? Well, if you have your Bible open, go back to the beginning of what we read, Luke 15, in verse 1 and 2, we find out that is the crowd that Jesus is addressing. Sinners, tax collectors, Pharisees, and teachers of the law. Jesus is addressing all before him and challenging them to consider their relationship with God and to understand that the love of God is for all people. This is truly a big, big story. But that said, it's hard to consider this story and then not consider how we fit. Where do we fit into this story? Years ago, when I began to attend seminary, one of the first two classes that I took was an introduction to spirituality. In that class, I was introduced to a theologian, a writer that's become sort of a mentor to me, Henry Nouwen. Nouwen was a Catholic priest who spent most of his life as an academic at some of those prestigious schools in America until he went to live out his final years in the La Arche community in Canada. If you're not familiar with that, it's pretty small. There are several of these La Arche houses around the world that exist to care for people with the most severe handicaps. Many of the residents require around-the-clock personal care. Nouwen went from being one of the most respected, sought-out teachers, writers, speakers of a generation to the daily care of the daily needs. All of the daily needs of a young man with incredible physical handicap. My own introduction to him was in the form of reading one of his books as I began seminary. The book was called The Prodigal Son. In it, he describes the time that he spent in contemplation before Rembrandt's famous painting of this story. I actually have a print of that in my office there. It made such an impression. He describes his interaction, his contemplation before this famous painting and his reflections on the biblical story. It was a powerful book for me and a very formative time. One giant takeaway, he contends that many go through seasons in life where we identify each of the three different characters in this story. Sometimes we are the younger son. Sometimes we are the older son. Sometimes, at our very, 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 very best, we might be the father to someone. Now, if you took some time right now, the question would be, where do you see yourself? Not many will see themselves as the father. More likely, if you are living out your very, very, very best for God, there will be times when somebody else might see you as the father for them. You are a signpost to God of God's love and mercy and grace. Most of us, most of the time, have to consider, which one of the sons am I right now? Do you find yourself trapped in a cycle running from the Father's love, desperately trying to return? Or do you find yourself realizing you're wearing a mask and the inside doesn't match the outside? Whether running or hiding, see in the Father